Hey everyone, welcome back. So in these videos I wanted to just start by recapping where we are, and then I'm going to cover what we're going to jump into content-wise for this week. So here we are in Blender. I've got the final Beetle actually modeled out here, and he's also rigged as well. And so in this week we're going to be focusing on presentation. So the plan is to basically set up some render scenes, do some nice screenshots, work on our lighting and everything. So for this week, that will be the plan going forward. Hey everyone. So just wanted to start with presentation this week. I'm going to talk about the screenshots that I actually did for the project and some of my thought process behind what I was trying to create here, and then we'll jump into actually setting up our scene. So for the presentation, I wanted to have, as I mentioned in my original plan, some simple presentation or a sort of plain scene where we basically just have a simple background, some reflections and some nice lighting. And then we have this more hero shot, which is the Beetle actually posed on the flower. As you can see here, we have water droplets and other things going on in that particular scene that give it a little bit more life and make it feel a bit more alive. So this is the aim that we're kind of going for with the different scenes. And we're going to cover the Beetle, the plain scene to begin with, and so we'll work on our setup and everything, and talk about the way that I tend to manage those renders and creating the scenes and everything there, and then we'll do the flower one after that. So the scenes to actually render out the Beetle are also really simple, so I thought I'd just show those before we jump into the creation. So here you can see this is the when we're rendering out the screenshots of the plain Beetle. So I basically just have a backdrop here, which we'll go over how to set this up. And then we have cameras and lights and everything. So you can see all the cameras coming in here for different positions. And then we have, if I jump over into the flower sections here, we have an area in this same file where we basically have a series of lights and cameras. And then we have the flowers in here. So, and depending on the different shot, we load in different sections. So in this case, we're loading in the actual flowers in the backdrop there, and then if we switch over to this view, you can see that we load in some other flowers here. So the setup for these is actually a lot more simple than you might expect. So I'm going to cover obviously how to do all of this, but I just wanted to show just as a overview, this is what we're aiming for this week. So before jumping in with our scene setup here, I just wanted to mention that there's a really great add-on called Photographer 5. This is for manipulating cameras and lights within Blender. It has a bunch of really great controls. You can see a bit of an overview here. Gives you some more support for lights such as gobos and other things and certain lens effects, and just makes managing cameras a lot easier. So the Photographer 5, which is the latest version, is $24. But alternatively, you can get a slightly older version or even a free version, which is the Photographer 2 add-on, which gives you some of these controls as well. So definitely worth taking a look at that if you're going to be working with lots of cameras in a scene. And so we will touch on it, but I'm not going to set the whole scene up using it. I just wanted to mention it. So the first thing we want to do in our scene here is we're going to come over to the asset browser. And so I'm just going to split this view as well. Just let me do that, and I'll bring in the asset browser. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set my asset browser to link, and I'm going to link in my Beetle model and the rig and everything. So we're going to bring that into the scene. And so once this is dropped in, I will just place him in the center of the scene. And so if you wanted to set that up, so we'll just join these areas back together, and we'll come back over to modeling here. So we have our Beetle and everything in the file. If you want to bring your rig in, let me just open up the Beetle file, and I can show how to actually do that as well if you're not seeing it in the asset browser. So what you would need to do here to add it is you essentially just right click and do mark as asset, and that's going to bring it into the asset browser. And so then you can set the path of the folder in the preferences. So you basically set up where you have this located within the asset library, and it will appear in your other files. So that's essentially how you get that working. So if we come back over to the file. So now we have our Beetle in here. At the moment, he's just a collection, and we can't really do anything with him. You can see him here. He's linked into the file. So to make this editable, so we can actually pose and rig and all that kind of stuff, we can override this by using what's called a library override. So we just right click on the collection and come down, hit make, and then selected and content. This will break the rig out into its individual pieces as it was in the original file, but it's still linked. So I can jump into pose mode, I can move the rig around. If I want to set up my scene and I want to move the beetle anywhere, my suggestion is that you do that in pose mode using the actual root bone. So if we start to move him kind of over here in the scene because we want to set up a little camera or something over here, when we save that scene and we just reload it, it's going to stay in that place, which is cool. If we don't do that, so if we come over into here and we were to just try and move him, say in object mode, then when we save the scene and we revert this, it's just going to jump the beetle back into its position. So sometimes the position of the beetle will reset basically. So something to keep in mind, it's much easier to basically move him in pose mode because you can keyframe that and leave him where he is in the position you want to. So I had a lot of instances where the beetle would jump back in position if it wasn't moved using pose mode. So I would just suggest using pose mode to move it. So next I want to cover how to set up a basic scene, and I've got a couple of examples of the type of thing I'm aiming for here. So we had the key shot, which is obviously the flower, which we'll cover in the next video. But in this one, I wanted to do something that was a bit more of a plain rendering scene. So I wanted something similar to this where we have a plain background, potentially with a gradient in the backdrop. And then we can have some soft shadows. In some cases as well, you can see we have mirror reflections. So I did a darker background for mine, so had mirror reflections, but you can do combinations of all of this type of stuff. So we'll just set up how I would approach that. So let me drop this in. And when I did my renders, I had gone for a plain dark background, and then we had the pink of the flower. So for this example, I'm probably going to do something that's just a little bit different so that we can so I can just do maybe like a colorful one or something like that. So let's take a look at that. The first thing I want to do is I'm just going to make a collection, and I'm going to call this backdrop. So I can add my backdrop meshes into that. So the first thing I want to do is add a cylinder mesh, and I'm going to move the pivot to the bottom of that. Actually, let's re-add that. I want to do, when I add the cylinder, I want there to be a lot of sides on the cylinder. So I'll set it to say 200 sides. Mostly because we're going to be doing a nice render here. I don't particularly want this to be any faceting or any issues with that type of stuff. So I'm essentially just going to smooth this out really nicely. We're going to delete the face of the top of the cylinder, and I want to move my beetle. So we'll move him in pose mode, and I'm just going to let's make sure that we have our gizmo there. I want to just hide the backdrop temporarily. I just want to make sure that he's a bit more central in the scene there. So he's a bit more centralized, which is cool. And then we can just come back out of pose mode, and that's going to look pretty good. So now we have our backdrop in there. Next thing I want to do is to create the gradient in the backdrop. I'm basically just going to bevel this cylinder. So I'm going to select the edges, and we're going to come over here and actually set, instead of a scene, we'll set a bevel weight. I'm just going to mark that up, and then I'm going to bevel this on that bevel weight so we can get a nice smooth gradient in our background. And I'll set that number to a really high value. So again, this is going to be really smooth, this backdrop here. Next, I want to set a camera. So we're going to add in a camera here, and we'll just set the camera. And so if I jump into that camera, it's placed somewhere random. We can't actually see our beetle. So we'll come into the view menu and do camera to view. Or alternatively, we can click up here as well. I think this is part of the photographer add-on though, this little button here. So if I come over in here, we can check that actually. So if I disable photographer, yeah, you don't see any of these controls that we see up here. So photographer will add a bunch of extra controls. So we'll disable it for now, and we can enable it back on there. So, okay, so yeah, we've got the camera. We're just going to sort of position this nicely, get a good shot, something like this. And then we can turn camera to view off, and now we can sort of zoom in and see our beetle. So we'll jump into Eevee mode so we can actually start to see what we're going to be rendering and how it's going to start to look, which is cool. So this is how it's looking currently. And then I want to make sure, if you don't have this set, you need to make sure you have scene lights and scene world enabled. If you don't have those, you're just going to be rendering with these standard HDRs. So I think I, in this scene, already have an HDR hooked up. So we'll cover the process of that so you can actually understand how to bring an HDR into the scene. So to do that, it's really straightforward. You come over into your shader editor. Just make sure we only have one of these here. And then instead of setting object, you'd set world. And then this is my setup here for an HDR. So I just have, I think it's a Marmoset Tomoko Studio one here. And so the way I have this set up is I have the texture plugged into a background layer and into a mix shader. And then I'm using isCameraRay from this node LightPath. So you can just search for LightPath, add isCameraRay into the factor there, and then the background. So the way that this works, if we just disable this portion of it, essentially what this is going to do is it's going to mask out the background. So if I jump over into the rendered view and we just make sure that we have everything set correctly. Yeah, so scene world, here we can see the scene itself now, right? So this is the HDR that we have in the background. So if I just plugged my HDR directly into the background like this is what we would see in the world view. You can see that it's actually rendering, it's creating some lighting for us based on that HDR that we can see. And then when we combine it with the mix shader and isCameraPath, this allows us to basically just get rid of the background and set a color. So now we could choose like, you know, a blue color and it's going to set a background there. So that's essentially what we're doing here with this particular setup for the HDR. So I just wanted to cover that really briefly. So now let's jump back over into our scene and we'll go over again to modeling, and I'm going to bring back our backdrop. So this is the basic setup, and in Eevee we can see that we have our scene lights and our scene world. So when we set to scene world, it's now using that HDR that we see in the background. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set my backdrop that I have here, and I want this to have a material to it. So we're going to add a material, and I'm just going to rename this to backdrop. So now we can hopefully see that we have our backdrop material, and I can set a color for this. So I can choose what type of color I want to go for. Maybe I'll go for more of a blue. I was thinking along the lines of like one of these kind of ones where it's like a bit more of a darker blue. So let's see if we can do something a bit cooler like that. So yeah, that could be a nice contrast. I like that color. That's looking pretty good. So for this, I don't want the background to be super reflective because you can see that it picks up a bunch of light and everything. It's a bit distracting. So I'm going to basically set my roughness to full rough. So now we don't see any reflections in the background. I can start now just adding basic lights into the scene as well. So we'll come out of the camera view, and then I'm just going to jump into the Shift A menu, sorry, to add a light. And we'll add just a regular area light into the scene. So we're going to move this area light up. And now you can start to see that we're getting some actual light in here as well. So we can dial this up to be a bit stronger. So now you can actually start to see that we have a light source and that's impacting things. So yeah, maybe about 50 watts, something like that for now. And you can sort of see how this is looking. We're going to polish and refine our lighting a bit later, but just want to show that. And also for now, I'm going to hide the bones because I don't need to see the bones for this particular robot for now. So this is how this is looking. So now I want to effectively set up a couple more cameras just so that we have some views from other directions. So I'll just duplicate the camera a couple more times. And I'm going to jump over into this one. And then again in view, we'll just lock camera to view. And I'm just going to move. I want one where I can see the background gradient a little bit better because that's nice to kind of judge how that's looking. And then I also just want one from maybe from the back a little bit so we can just see another view, right? Okay, so we've got our camera set up. The next thing I'm going to do is just do a little bit more organization. So we're going to make a folder for cameras and we're going to put cameras into the background there. And then I'm going to make one for lights and we're just going to put our lights in. So now I want a little bit more control over the way I can actually edit and change the way I'm going to visualize my render. So we're just going to hide our cameras. I want to be able to move lights around easily and light the object how I want, have a bit more control over it. And I also would quite like to get some more mirror style reflections underneath the object. So I'm going to set up some controls for that as well. So let's go through that as our next thing. So for the lights, what I want to do here is I want to add a empty. So we'll add the empty into the middle of the scene. And then for the light, we want to effectively have this always, as we move this around, we want it to always be facing the beetle, right? And so one way we can do that in the light itself, if we click the object constraints, we can use a damped track. So if we choose the damp track option and then color pick that empty, so it can be a little bit hard to select with the backdrop. So you can always just hide the backdrop if that makes things easier. And then we can choose the direction in which we want it to point at. So at the moment, this is pointing up. The blue arrow is the Z axis pointing upwards. So we would select negative Z because we want it to point downwards. And so as we now move this light around, you'll see that it nicely just points always at that empty, which is great. So that means that just positioning lights is going to be a lot easier. We can also just jump into the light and rotate the light if we need a bit more of a specific position, but that just makes things a lot easier when it comes to positioning lights and jumping into the scene and everything there, and trying to get our light sources working. So you can add more lights in and do different results, and you can kind of see how we can easily light up our beetle in the way that we want. So that's the first step. We'll just leave this light how it is for now. And then the next step I want to do is add the reflection in. So to add the reflection, I'm going to come in here with my meshes, and I'm going to choose a circular mesh. For this one, I want to scale him up a little bit. And then I'm just going to press F to fill this. So now we have a circle underneath the beetle, and I want to just slightly move him up so he's not Z-fighting with the floor. We can change this to be a little bit closer as well if we want to, and you can see that now that's really close to the floor but not Z-fighting, which is cool. So as we jump into our camera views, we can see, and one thing to be aware of is if you have camera to view selected, when you zoom on the mouse wheel, you'll start to zoom in. So just untick this and you can actually zoom your camera view in a bit nicer. And then in the cameras, we can jump between those by just clicking this button here. So next I'm going to set up the material for this, and I want to set just a material, and we're going to call this floor. Okay, so let me just look at this, and then I'm going to change the color of that. So we'll just copy the color from our previous one and paste it in here. For this guy, we're going to want this to be nice and shiny because you can see that it creates this reflection for the floor, which is looking really cool. But one of the things that we run into with this reflection is that there's a couple of issues that we run into. First is that we get the reflection of the HDR, which is probably not a huge issue if we were to have this not be such a mirror reflection. If it was like slightly blurred, it wouldn't be so much of a problem that it picks up some of that light from the surrounding areas, from the world and everything. But we also have the reflection of the light source in there, which is probably not something that we would necessarily want to capture when we're trying to take screenshots and things. And then the other issue is we have this seam where it goes from where it's nice and shiny and reflective to completely rough, right? So we can fix these things really easily. So for the seam issue, I'm going to come over into shading. And so for this, what I want to do is I want to come to the object material that we have here. And I'm going to press Control T to bring in a texture. And so for this particular case, I actually just have a one already set up with a texture. So I'm going to grab that. This texture is just a radial gradient, basically. So I can show the texture itself. So let me just bring the image editor in here. And I'll just choose the gradient. So this is just a radial gradient, right? That's the texture we're plugging in, and we want to plug this into the alpha. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come over to UV editing, and I'm going to select that object, and I'm just going to UV it, right? So now you can see that the gradient is in the right place, which is cool. And if I jump now back over to the shading view, we don't see anything. At the moment, we don't really see anything happening though. There's still a seam. So we need to come into our material and scroll down until we see viewport display and set this to alpha blend. So now that will blend out that edge, and you can see that we have our reflections without the seam, which is looking pretty good. So we can save that, jump back over now into the modeling tab, and let's see if we can fix some of the other issues like the light reflection here, for example. So for this guy, there's a few ways to fix this. There used to be in Cycles, you used to be able to turn off the multiple importance option here, and it would usually get rid of reflection. So you can see that that is actually doing a pretty good job. We can just disable it and then it's not coming in. So you just disable the reflection of the light source there. For some reason, there isn't an issue here, but what happens is when it's rendering, it looks like it's creating a strange problem there. So just something to keep in mind with the render. I don't know why it creates this kind of like weird seam. It's just like it's there isn't a problem there. It's just that it sort of as it works through the scene itself, it seems to be like having some sort of weird thing. But there's nothing going on there. I just wanted to kind of mention that as well. Cool. So that's all looking pretty good. The other thing that's also worth mentioning is that if you're having any issues with light sources, or you want to do something specific with lights, because later on as we get into say adding rim lights into things, we might move a light source kind of down here, and then we want to basically have sort of move this kind of around here, and then we want to have a very, very bright light to create like a cool rim light, and we can move this down and then maybe kind of rotate the light. Let's see if we can just position this a bit better. I think also because this has the damped track on it, it's a bit harder to position. So I'm just going to try and do that there. Yeah, so you can sort of see that as we are trying to create this rim light, which is going to be a light on the edge of the beetle, the problem we have is it's also impacting the floor, and that's not very good. So one of the ways that we can prevent that from happening is by using Blender's light linking feature, which is a new feature they added recently in Blender. So to do that, it's really easy setup. All you do is you click new and it will create a light link for this particular light. And then from there, you drag the collections that you want to be impacted by this light into that area there. And you'll see now that it's only impacting the backdrop. So if we untick that, it's now going to be impacting the beetle. And so with this floor circle, we need to just bring this into the backdrop. And now you can see that the rim lighting that we've added in there is only impacted by the beetle. So this is a nice way to basically have lights that are only impacting certain areas. And so you can use this for impacting reflections and things on the floor as well, because on lights, you can individually turn off the way that the reflection is working. So if you come to viewport visibility here, you can see that we have a glossy reflection. So if we turn glossy off, that won't be captured in the reflections. So if you wanted to isolate a light on the floor and remove the reflection, you can turn off the ray visibility and glossy. So that's another way to remove that sharp reflection that you sometimes get. So yeah, but that's the kind of basics of the scene. So let's just get this back into here. At the moment, in Eevee, this is looking kind of crazy, right? Because we have our rim lighting, and in Eevee, the light linking doesn't work. So if we turn this guy off, it's going to look a lot more how we'd expect. So as we're working, we're going to be rendering everything, the final result within Cycles. So it's good to just maybe turn on Cycles as you're working. It's a little bit harder to visualize when you're working in Eevee. So that's something that isn't going to work for, say, light links if you're relying heavily on light linking and you have lights. I mean, you can definitely position lights a bit better than what I have here so that it isn't going to necessarily be impacting the floor in the same way. And maybe tone down the intensity of that as well, because it is pretty bright. So yeah, so you can get it to be a bit more reasonable in terms of the Eevee view, but obviously that's going to look quite different when you jump over into Cycles. So something to just keep in mind there for how when you're doing your presentation and everything. Okay, so now we've built out our basic render scene. We will obviously be refining the lighting and polishing the scenes a little bit after we set up the next one. So the next scene I want to set up is the flower scene. And so to begin with, we have most of our stuff contained in here. I'm going to try and keep ourselves organized again. And I'm going to put all of this content into plain scene. I'm just going to create a folder for it. And then just move all of this into here. So this is everything that we want to essentially turn on when we're working with this smaller kind of backdrop scene where we have our simple backdrop and our lighting and our cameras and everything. So we can keep all of that in there, and I'll just hit save. And then what I'll do here is I'm just going to kill off these different scenes up here. So in the top right hand side, you basically have scenes, and then you also have render views. So these render views are really useful for essentially creating different render setups within the same scene. So for this one, we can just rename it to plain scene. And then what I'll do is I'll create a new collection, and I'm going to create the flower scene here. And so for the rig, I actually want to basically duplicate the rig. So I want to have the same, all of the same stuff as before. So probably the easiest way to do this would just be to come into the asset browser again. So we'll save this and just jump over into our asset browser. And we'll just pull the asset browser in. And then I'm going to grab my Beetle in here as well. And we'll just reset him back to the world 0 again. So let's move him into the center. And so we can build this scene wherever we want, this flower scene. It can be in the center of the scene, or we can move it somewhere else, offset. I think in my example, I moved it just so I had some space and everything. I could just move it somewhere else. So we can do that. We'll just override. Let me hide these for now. And so when we're working with multiple scenes, one of the ways that we can do that is we set up our new kind of scenes that we have here. So for this one, for the plain scene, we don't want the flower scene to be loaded. So we basically just hit E to hide it from the render view. So that means that when you render your screenshots, it's not going to be visible. It's turning it off, disabling it. And then we'll make a new one. And this new view layer is going to be the flower scene. So now what I'll do for the flower scene is I'll disable the plain scene and just have the flower scene loaded. So that means we can easily jump between these different view modes. And then for scenes, you can set up different scenes when you want to change the resolution of your images. So you could have, say, like a 16:9 scene, and then you could have a square one. This is where I found Photographer to be very helpful, because it allows you to jump between scenes and things really easily, and you don't need to worry about what happens here in this area. So we can cover that in a bit more detail later, but just have a look here. So we now have the Beetle again. I'm going to take, for this guy, I'm just going to make this a library override again. And I want to just position the Beetle. So we'll come into pose mode, and I'm just going to move him. Let's move him kind of up here and sort of over to the side somewhere. And this is where I'm going to set up my scene for the flower and the Beetle and everything there. So just sort of position him, and we'll set the object and everything, and we'll just hit save. Okay, great. So now I should be able to jump between the different scenes. You can see we can still see everything in this camera, and then when we jump over here, we should be able to just hit this button and see the Beetle over here. So we'll set up cameras and things as we go. So next I just want to cover the flowers and how I created those. I'm not going to do an in-depth tutorial about how I created the flowers, but we'll just do a quick overview of those meshes. So for these, obviously, I had the reference for the flowers that I was creating. And so the way I broke these guys down is into, they have these kind of stem sections where the flowers and the petals actually come out of once the flower starts to open up. And then they have the actual petals. So I basically made 3 different types of petals and then made these flower arrangements. So here we have the flower, one of them opened, and then this one that's a little bit more closed. So you can kind of see all the pieces of the flower there. These are just baked and textured in Substance Painter. Same process as we did for the Beetle. So these are what those guys look like. And then all I was doing when I was bringing those into the scene, and this is actually a little bit easier than what I was doing here with the asset browser and linking, is I basically select my flower object and just paste it into the scene. And so now we have the flower and the textures are all set up and everything here. And then I can actually start to use this to build out my scene. So I have this one flower, I can come in here, and then we can just, let's have a look here, kind of position this flower. So the beetle is basically going to sit on this petal. And so for the scale and everything, you can scale this guy down or up a little bit. And I also found if you add a simple deform modifier to this and set this to bend, you can create some nice deformation where the flower is a little bit more bent and has some shape and everything to it. So we'll start just by setting up the camera and everything that we want to go for. So I originally wanted, looking at the reference of the photo I was kind of going for, I wanted this idea that there was a couple of flowers that were closed up in the foreground like this, and then there was a few smaller ones to help reinforce that, right? So we have this flower already in the scene and everything, and then we can place a few more, and then in the background it's just nice and blurred out, so you can see some flowers, but we're not worried about the detail as much. So that's essentially what we're trying to build out here. So I'll save this. I'm going to add in a camera here, and we'll set the camera up. So let's go to the view and camera to view, and then I'm just going to bring this camera over so we can start to position our beetle. And I'm interested in just kind of framing this up in a way where it shows the beetle in a nice direction and everything. So I'm basically looking at this kind of thing for reference, like position wise, and then I'm just sort of trying to get this in frame, right? So this is also where I found Photographer to come in handy. So I'm going to show you some settings that I found useful here. So firstly, it allows you to manage your cameras a lot easier. So we can actually set the names and things for this camera. So this one can be for camera, flower, camera. And then to jump between cameras here in Photographer, you can just basically click these buttons and it's going to jump between the different scenes. So yeah, let's just kind of do that here. And then also with the view layers, you can see that each one of these cameras will have the different view layers. So if we were to enable view layers and then we set like our cameras and everything, I think that one is actually the flower camera, looking at it. Yeah, so when we come through these, we can basically set up the view layers for each of these cameras to load the correct one when we click the camera. So then for this guy, I'm going to view layer. This one is actually going to be the flower scene. And then this one is actually going to be the plane scene that we have there. So actually you don't know. Camera. Yeah, I'm not actually sure with that one. Let's just turn these guys back on again. So don't actually, I seem to have moved this other camera that we have, that's this bottom one. So the other thing that's nice with Photographer is you can quickly jump into the view mode here. So you can see that we can change lock to camera view and then change our camera positions and everything. All right, so that one actually should be, that one should be the main camera. So let's just adjust that camera. We'll put that kind of here. So yeah, for working with multiple cameras, this is really great. Like it gives you a lot of control to sort of get the cameras in the positions that you want, and then enable the view layers as well. So as you're working and everything here, we can do that. So this one here, flower scene. Oh yeah, so this camera, I think we also have this camera as part of this, right? It's actually in the scene. So this flower camera is actually our main camera. So let's do main camera. And I would usually give these names. So we'll do plain main camera. You can do all of this in the cameras themselves by just double clicking them. So if you're not using Photographer, I'm just doing this for speed because it's nice and quick. So this is our plain main camera. This one is, say, plain back camera. And then this one is plain front camera, for example. And then this one is our flower one. Flower scene front. Okay, so now we have our cameras and everything set up really nicely. And what I want to do is just make sure these cameras are in the right places. So this one here for the flower scene, we need a camera folder, and for the flower camera, we're going to put that in there. So now we can disable things correctly. You'll see that this is grayed out because we can't actually jump into that scene, right? But you can see that as we go through these, we can do that. So yeah, and then as we jump in, so if we go over to the flower scene, now we can jump over into that camera and see this one is all working pretty nicely, which is great. And then we're going to also set up a folder here for flower, and we'll put that into the flower scene folder as well. Great. Okay, so this is all starting to come together and look pretty nice, and we've got our cameras and everything set up so we can easily jump between different areas. One of the things that's also really nice about this is as we are sort of manipulating our cameras and everything, with Photographer, the camera's settings are based on real world settings. So what you can do here is choose things like what type of millimeter lens you have. So if you wanted to go for, say, like a zoom lens or something, then you could do that, and then position, like kind of reposition your camera and everything. And then we also have things like depth of field, so we can set up our depth of field, and then we can also set the focus plane as well here, so we can pick where we want that to kind of appear, and then everything else in the background is going to get nicely blurred out, which is pretty good. We have post effects that we can add to the cameras, so we can set our exposure, white balance, and then this is where we set the resolution of the image. So this is really helpful because you can do this per camera. So if I wanted to, say, render out a 1080p image, you can see this is how that's set up. But if I equally wanted this, instead of it being what it is at the moment, which is 16:9, I could set it to, say, a square ratio, and that's going to set the camera up correctly. So I don't have to change my output resolution over here. It will just render out at the correct output, basically, which is set by the camera. So that's something that is really handy when it comes to the way that we format our images and everything. We can set our aspect ratio down here. And then, as I said, you can do view layers and everything. And then you can also render all of your images at once. So if we were to jump back over to the plane scene, we could, say, render all 3 of those particular screenshots that we're looking at here. So we could jump over into our shot here. And so in this case, we can actually render 3 images at once rather than having to render just the one image one by one, right? So that's also pretty handy. There are there's a light mixer as well, so we can easily tweak the colors and controls of our lights, which is something that can be really nice when it comes to just quick tweaks, and we can disable and enable lights and kind of get a feel for how things are looking, which is great. So again, that's a really nice little feature from the add-on. So there's a bunch of things we can play with our world strength and emissives and everything if we've got emissives in the scene. So yeah, bunch of cool options here in the Photographer view. But we'll jump out of that. Let's now get back into the camera for the flower. So I just want to set up a little bit more with that scene. So what I like to do if I'm working on stuff like this as well is I'll basically set up 2 view modes for the 3D view, so I can actually start to work in 3D but still look at the camera. So we're going to just move this flower here. We're going to scale him down a little bit, and then I'm going to go for just rotate this guy a little bit. So I want to just rotate the flower maybe kind of like this, and we'll just tweak the bend of this one a little bit. So I'm starting to just build out this scene with the flowers and everything. And then I'm also I can look in here as well. So we can position where we want this to sort of go roughly. And then maybe we'll bend him a little bit more. Yeah, let's kind of go something like this. And we also want these, ideally we don't want these to kind of intersect with each other. So just try and position them as best as you can where you have that type of result. And if you don't have flower meshes, you can also download some from something like Megascans would be a good thing to use as an example. If you don't want to make your own, that would be something else I would suggest. And then for the backdrop, I basically just, really basic, I moved a bunch of the flowers kind of out in the distance and then just started to kind of scale them up. And I'm not worried with this. I'm not so worried about the detail of these because I'm going to depth of field blur them out. So I'm essentially just trying to get a bunch of like pink backgrounds, but using these flowers so it feels like it kind of makes a bit more sense. So we can just sort of scale these out like this. And then I also do have, in my original flower scene, I have these guys as well, which are a bit more opened up. So they can be pretty nice for just coming in and filling out space in the background as well. So we can just sort of try to position these roughly where we want to get the look that we're after. So just sort of rotating and filling out the space in the background so it feels like it's nicely detailed, right? And then I'll show you kind of the lighting. We'll do a pass on lighting in a bit, but you can see that we're able to fill that out nicely. I actually want to get less of that kind of green section there, so we're just looking pretty good. All right, so that's already starting to come together. And now what we want to do is in here we want to actually view the scene and maybe look at like the lights a little bit more and things like that. So yeah, and these flowers have a subsurface on them, so you can see that's why we're getting this kind of light permutating through the surface of those. We'll look at this in, I think that's got scene world and scene light enabled. I want to basically add in a light source as well. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to duplicate from the lights that we already created from here, because we already had these like lined up with the empty and everything. So I want to just duplicate those particular lights and bring them into the flower scene. And then we will tweak our lights and everything as I mentioned later. I just want to start by, I think I'm going to just parent these two together. Whoops, let's do it the other way. Okay, and then I should just be able to move this light source and we'll get that kind of roughly. So this one I'm trying to move the light kind of into where the flower is, and then I can rotate the empty and spin the light around, right? So that gives me the result that I'm after. And then we can just move our light source out. We can see kind of how that's already looking, which is pretty cool. So yeah, that's already looking pretty good. And then let's just now close the plane scene. We don't need that anymore. And I want to just have a quick look at how this is looking in the rendered view. Okay, great. So that's already starting to look good. I want to tweak my cameras. So I'm just going to join these back together. So to tweak the camera, I want to play with the depth of field, because at the moment this is too in focus in the background and it's not quite doing what I want here. So yeah, and I want to also play around with, maybe we can play around with the background, the world a little bit, because the intensity of it's quite strong. So I just want to kind of pull that back a little bit and I'm going to rely more on my lights and everything. And then yeah, let's play. So if I go for the higher the aperture, the less depth of field we have. So if we reduce that aperture down, you'll see that we get a lot more of a blurry result basically. But this is also dependent on the distance that these are from the camera as well. So if they're really close to the camera, they won't get blurred out very much, right? So that's something to consider. And then it also is dependent on your actual focal length as well, because this is all based on real world cameras. So if we go to say 200mm, which is basically a much higher zoomed in lens, and then we kind of pull this out a bit, what you'll see is that we can position this and then we can just come in with our depth of field. Let's just go, wait, hang on, let's click that again. So now if we come in with our focal point and click the beetle, this in the background is going to be a lot more blurrier than it was before because we are a lot more zoomed in. So if we do the same thing with a 400mm and then we were to do the same thing, kind of zoom out and refocus, you can see that this is a lot blurrier now in the background and a lot more zoomed in. So that's all stuff that you can play around with when it comes to cameras. I think 100mm is actually quite nice in terms of what I'm seeing in the shot. So I'm going to just put that back to 100 and then I'm going to refocus on the beetle. And that feels like pretty good to me. What I'd like to do is maybe move things backwards a little bit. So let's try and do that. So we'll just jump out of lock camera view. And then because these are quite close, so we can just move all of our flowers. So let's grab these guys. And I'll split the view so I can see this in two windows, right? So I'm going to see this in the rendered view so we can see what we're actually moving things, how we're actually moving things, and then also in this kind of global view. So just sort of move these back a bit and then maybe scale them up. Let's do something like that. And I'm not worried about this being perfect, right? Because we can always just refine the positions of these are always we can always refine them later, so it's not really a huge problem if these aren't in the perfect spot or we're not quite happy with how one flower looks and things like that, because we got the overall look correct, then we can start to polish positions and things like that, right? So always just trying to do the biggest things first, like get the overall look of the image correct before we start to polish things, right? So yeah, you can see that now that's like really blurred out in the background. Okay, so if I jump over into rendered view now, just wait for that to render out. So yeah, now you can see that the background is really blurry and soft, which is cool. And we could even put lights in the background to light up the background a bit more, because at the moment this is dark. We can obviously tweak our background strength as well for that, so we get a little bit more of like an ambient lighting in the background, which is probably actually more than enough for what we need. So yeah, you can see that. And then if we want slightly less blurry, we just basically bring up our field of view. So we can even, this is supported in Eevee, so if we want to jump over into Eevee, we can actually dial in the depth of field in Eevee a bit easier because you can see it. It's not rendering, right? So we can choose like, this is what 1.2 looks like. We could go up to say 5.6. That's obviously a lot more in focus, right? So depending on this, we can experiment with what type of look is looking pretty nice. I like somewhere in between, maybe 1.8, 1.4 is pretty nice. So yeah, that's kind of how we're building out the flower scene. And then just to kind of finalize this particular shot, we will polish things a bit more in the next session, and lighting and everything is the next thing we want to work on. But I want to just refine the position of the beetle. So we have the beetle actually placed here, but because we have access to his rig and all the individual things, we can just jump over into pose mode and we can actually pose this, right? So we want to have, say, select his feet and just position his feet to line up. You know, we just essentially move the feet into position, right? So it's just as simple as that. So all that work that we've done on the rigs and everything and getting this all looking good pays off when we get to this stage, because we can just align our bones where we want and just rotate everything and get the feet to line up on the actual petals, which is cool. So yeah, it's always nice to be able to do this when you've got that final, because I worked like a long time on this project where I didn't have the rig kind of figured out, and I was taking screenshots of like how I planned to present this on the flowers. And so obviously like at that time I didn't have a rig, so everything was just clipping into the flowers and it wasn't looking kind of finalized. And as soon as I got the rig, the mesh finished and I started to do the rig, and then I was able to just do the pose, the screenshots just feel so much more complete because the legs are actually in the right places. Everything is looking how it's supposed to look. Like it looks like a real real thing, right, with the legs and everything. So that's like a nice turning point when you can actually position everything how you want it to be on the beetle and everything. We also have our clipping of the wings and things like that. So that's where those kind of poses in the asset browser come in handy as well. So when we have our asset browser, if I just bring that over and we'll jump over into our asset browser here, and then we'll jump over to our poses. Ignore the fact there's quite a few poses in here. That's because it's loading a lot of autosave files and things like that. But we can just come over into hiding, say, everything but the wings. We'll just select all the wings bones. And then one of the poses that we have is this wings collapsed. So that will basically stop it from clipping into the outside of the shell. Because if we have them straight out like that, you'll see they clip kind of slightly out of the shell. So we can just double click that to position our bones. And now we have a really nice sort of shot. Everything is like lined up and positioned how we kind of want to get it working there. So that's looking pretty cool. I'm going to stop it there and we'll work on polish and lighting and everything next. Okay, so now I've got the basic scene set up. I've got my plain scene and my flower scene set up. I want to start polishing and refining my screenshots, improving the lighting and just getting some more final renders together here. So the next step is to just briefly explain about how the types of lighting I would definitely suggest going for. So for prop rendering and smaller props when you're focusing on a single source, a 3-point lighting setup is a really good standardization for rendering subjects. And you can see a bunch of descriptions of how 3-point lighting tends to work here. So usually you have your subject and you have a camera, and then you have 3 light sources, hence why it's called 3-point lighting. And you have a key light, a backlight, and a fill light. The key light is your main light source that defines the direction of the shadows and gives you the main intensity of light in the scene. And then you have backlighting, or sometimes called rim lighting as well. And then you have a fill light. So rim lighting can be, or backlighting can be used to basically get the subject to jump off of the background. So you can use it as a tool to separate the subject from the background. So this is also a really good example of that. So you can see here, this is what the key lighting does. The backlighting is actually separating the subject. You've got this almost like a rim of light that kind of comes around the subject here. And then our fill light basically fills out any darker shadows. So as you kind of see it here, this is sort of as they come together, you have your key light plus your rim lighting. And then when you add your fill lighting, you fill out all of these really dark areas of the scene and have much more of a neutral lighting setup there. So that's what a 3-point lighting setup is. And it's something that I tend to use when I'm rendering my models in a lot of cases. And even for the scene with the flower, I'm using the same setup as a 3-point lighting setup. So to do that, we'll start with this guy. We're going to rename our light sources as well and get that set up here. So for this guy, the first thing I want to do is this is going to be my key light. So we'll just call this key light. And then this one here, I've already got one that's representing a backlight or a rim light. So we'll just call this rim light. And then I'm going to duplicate the key light here. So we'll just Shift D and create a new one. And this one is going to be our fill light. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, we'll move the fill light round. So we're going to bring this in here. The fill light in general, we don't need to be as large. So with these, I tend to use area lights, and I usually use square area lights for this type of result. And what you'll notice if we turn off everything except the key light source, because this will be nice and obvious, is depending on the size of the light, depends on how it renders things like the shadows. So if we have a much smaller light source, you'll see that we get much sharper lights, and they fall off at distance like a real light source would do, but it's very sharp. The shadows are sharp. If you have reflections, they'll be sharper as well because we have a smaller light source. And then as we increase the size of this, that impacts the size of the reflections and also the sharpness of the shadow. So you can see we get a much sharper shadow. So for this one, you could potentially use a much larger light source. And then depending on the distance you have the light from the object, you're going to get different results, right? So As you can see here, if we move that really close, we'll get a very diffused light source. So depending on the distance, you can get a different look. Generally with lights, I'll try to avoid having completely white lights because that doesn't look that great. Usually want some color in it. So if we were doing like a light bulb or a sun, we could potentially look at having a slight yellow tint to the light. And for the rim light, I tend to have these guys aren't going to necessarily be so important to cast shadows because often they're behind the object, so it's less important about it casting shadows. And in this case, they tend to be brighter, so you can get a nice lighting on the rim. And I will often colorize those maybe to be blue, just because I think generally blue kind of colors for rim lights tends to look a bit nicer. And also in this case, it will complement what we have going on in the background there as well. And then for the fill light, I often like to create this as maybe like a bit more of a warmer light, so maybe red or orange. And that way it's just going to complement the other colors we have in there. So it's just going to create some nice result. And I'll basically position this to face where the shadows are and have a much lower intensity for these. So we'll go maybe say for 10. And you'll see that with that, if we turn this one on and off, it's going to fill out those darker shadow areas. So you can sort of see that there. Maybe 10 is actually a little bit bright, so we can go for 5. And I think maybe this is a bit saturated, so I'm just going to pull back on the saturation a bit. And then for the rim light, don't be afraid to use more than one rim light, because you can use this to effectively come around the object and create nice separation with the background. So you can kind of see how this is now looking. So we have a few different rim lights there. That's fine. And then what we want to do, I'm just going to save this. I'm going to have a look at this in the rendered view because it's looking pretty good in Eevee, but it's always nice to take a look in there. And you can see that things are looking a bit weird. So I want to come through and check what I've got going on here. It's probably to do with the light linking. So let's have a look at that. So we have our key light. That seems to be doing things that are looking pretty good. And I can check in here as well about the light linking to make sure what's using light linking. And then the fill light isn't using any light linking, and it's creating some light on the floor. So I think what I'd like to do here is basically just remove the flooring from this. So we'll do that with the light linking, and now you can see that there. And I think this is maybe a little bit strong actually. So I'm going to tweak to a much lower intensity and just keep this like a little bit more basic. And then for the rim lights, let's kind of get into those as well. So these are already set up to not impact the backdrop. I think with the turning the cast shadows off on these has caused the issue. So I'm going to turn cast shadows back on these rim lights. That should hopefully give us a pretty nice result. So yeah, we can see how that's looking. I'm not super happy with the shadows on how everything is very, very soft at the moment with that big light source. So I'm going to play around with maybe tweaking the size of our key light source to see what we can get as far as that's concerned. I think that's looking a bit better, so we can now see how things are looking overall. And then now we're kind of looking at this as well. I like to see if I can tweak maybe the colors of things slightly. So it's always worth playing around with the color of the background and the floor. I was thinking maybe like introducing a little bit more green into the floor could be kind of nice. So I just want to play around with that concept. I quite like just to maybe tint. Sometimes it's good to tint the different areas, different colors as well. And then for this one, for the reflections, experimenting with metallic can be kind of nice because sometimes it gives like interesting results to the reflections. So if you have a metallic reflection, you see the reflections a lot clearer. So you can kind of see that there. I probably don't want the reflections to be completely mirror clear. So if I change the roughness of the floor slightly, you can see that we can basically blur the reflections a little bit there. So sort of tweaking the colors and the values slightly, this is the effect that we can get. And I think that's in a pretty nice place. I like where that's going. Cool. So I'm going to leave that one there for now. So I just jump back over to Eevee again. This obviously is going to look a little bit different, but that's okay. So what I'd like to also do is fix the wing position on the rig here. So we'll just come over into this guy, and then over in the where are we? So now we need to come over into the asset browser. So we'll just split this view, and I'm going to set this to asset browser, and I'm just going to pick my wing collapsed pose. Okay, so now we can just collapse this down, just join these areas back together. So yeah, this is now starting to look pretty good. Let's have a look. Going to turn off the render views as well. Great, and then I can jump. Now I've got this kind of set up, I can also jump to the other cameras and just look at how this is looking in the other camera views. So one thing you'll notice is when we jump over to this one, the lights, obviously the rim lights are blowing everything out. So what I did for my own renders, and in this case I'm probably just going to kill off this back camera because we don't need it for the purpose of this tutorial. But for what I did when I was rendering this out for the final result in terms of my screenshots, was I created another layer where I could basically have different lighting setups depending on the camera view. So that's essentially how I combated those problems. But you can see this is already looking pretty interesting. So that's good. Okay, so now I want to work on the lighting for the flower scene, and that will just be the same process as what we've done here. So we'll jump over into our flower lighting and everything. This one should hopefully be a little bit more straightforward because there isn't too much to do on this one, because we just need to do the lighting here. So we come in, let's see, so we've got our lights. I'm going to create a folder for our lighting. So we'll move that in there, and the area light. So for the area light, I want to jump out of pose mode, otherwise I won't be able to edit the light. So for this one, I just want to set a slightly more yellow kind of light source. And in the scene itself, I actually used gobos. So for gobos, these are part of the photographer add-on. You can basically select, I don't think you'll see them in Eevee, if I'm not mistaken, but basically you can select these masks and things. So we'll see if we can see it when we jump over into... So I realized what you needed to tweak. It's actually the beam shape. So if the beam shape is set to 180, the gobo won't show up. So you set that, you can see that now we have this gobo, which is basically like a projected texture you can use to create these kind of really interesting results. So depending on the textures that you plug into here, it will create interesting kind of results here. So this one is like with a window gobo. So for this, I wanted to use like a vegetation style gobo because that obviously gives like the feeling that it's a bit more in a natural style environment. So that's essentially what I did. I used this one. There's a sharp and a sort of blurrier one as well, so you can get the kind of result. And then scaling up the lights, if we scale up the size of the light, we can start to influence how we're actually seeing. It almost looks like it's being projected through some trees and things there. And now we've got the intensity of the light, we can kind of dial this back down and experiment with like the scale and everything for softer shadows and everything. So yeah, so that's a way to kind of go if you want to use. That's what I did for the renders I created here, was I used a gobo. And then I had a couple of other light sources where I brightened things up without gobo. So like another light source that just didn't have a gobo, but I could still get the shadows and everything that I was after for the render and everything there. So that's another approach that you can take. For now, we'll turn off the gobo. I just wanted to show that process because I thought it was cool when I was working on it. Let's go back over to having, I think it was 50 we had before. I just want to play with the intensity of that. And then for the scale of the light, I'm going to just make sure we have a little bit more. Let's go back over to, I want to go back over to Eevee mode and try and tweak that here. So yeah, it's interesting when you're in Eevee mode, the fall off of these lights is a lot different. So when we look at here and then we jump over to this version, This one is a lot sharper. I think because the spread angle is changed there. So if we switch the spread angle, we get a much more reliable result. So that's already looking pretty nice. We're getting some rim lighting already from the HDR. So that's not too bad already. I do want to come in here and basically add a fill and a couple of rim lights in here. So we'll just position another light source here. For this one, I'm going to rotate him, and I want this one to be, I'm just going to move him a little bit closer, and it's definitely not going to be as intense, and we'll go maybe a little bit more red in the lighting again. And for this one, I'm just going to tweak maybe a bit more of a blue rim lighting there. To match the rim lighting we've already got, though, we might want to slightly desaturate that, and we can come up in intensity. Let's go slightly. Okay, great. So yeah, that's already looking pretty good. I want to look at the rendered view. I'm going to look at the world strength. So that's impacting the... Yeah, I'm thinking about maybe getting a light in the background to brighten up. I like the way the pink is kind of bouncing up onto this guy. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, so what I want to do now is just work on the background a bit. So I'm going to just move this so that we don't have a gap at the top of the frame there. We can just maybe refine the position of that a little bit. So try and rotate that one out a bit. Okay, so yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I want to... So for the background, because all the flowers are actually at the moment, they're all in one folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this flower background, basically. So actually, we can keep that within the flower folder, actually. That's fine. So we'll say flower background. And then all these background ones, select those and just move those into that collection. So now we can just turn the background off. But what's cool about that is we can have another area light, which will unparent from the object damped track here. I'm just going to reset this. And so for this guy, I want to basically use that to kind of light up what we see in the background, but I don't want it to affect any of the lighting that we already have kind of going on in the scene. So to do that, we can just kind of point the light roughly where we want it to kind of be. It's going to hit like some of these lights and everything here. And then what I'm going to do is for this one, under the collections, we'll basically grab the flower background as the only collection that this is impacting. So now we can probably move this as well because he's pretty high up in the scene. Let's just sort of move him there. Try and get him like roughly in the same. And just copy the location of this one so at least it feels like it is in the right place. Sort of move it out a bit. Okay, so now let's look at the rendered view and see what that's looking like. I think it's probably going to be very blown out in the background. Oh, actually not as much as I thought it was. So let's try and increase that. Okay, so now what you can see is I basically have this control to brighten up the flowers in the background just with this one light, but it's not impacting, it's not being impacted by any of the other lighting. So we can basically just make that a bit brighter because one of the problems without that is that we get some of the, it's just a little bit too dark, and also we're getting some of the lighting from the world coming in there, whereas once we start to light it from the other side, we don't have that subsurface coming through as much, and you can kind of see how that's looking there. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. We can obviously change like the position of some of these lights, like rotate them around. We wanted to get like a different kind of feel and maybe more shadows and things. We can move some of those areas. Let's try and maybe I'm going to play with the intensity of this light a little bit as well, just to try and, so I want to see if I can pop out the beetle just a little bit more, but not, I don't want to blow out the lighting too much. So yeah, something like that feels pretty good. And then I think on the rig as well, I quite like to maybe angle him up a bit. So just going to jump over into pose mode and we'll just grab the body bone. Let's do this just in this view actually. So I'll just try and... Yeah, so he's now following the direction of the flowers like a little bit more, which is cool. I'll jump over to rendered view again. Yeah, maybe that's like a little bit too much. Pose mode. Try and do this in rendered view. Might be a little bit hard because it's it's catching up. Yeah, let's just do it here. It's easier. Okay, let's try that. So yeah, now at this stage we're kind of like getting to a good place. So it's always just about like tweaking and refining where you're at with that sort of stuff and just polishing everything else that you have. So yeah, but that's kind of getting across the idea I wanted to get across in terms of the rendering and the presentation. You can kind of see how that's coming together. Great. So next up, I want to just show how we're going to take those into more final images and screenshots with how we're going to export them and present them. Okay, so now we're going to actually render out the images. So the first one I'm going to start with here is with the beetle. So you can jump over into, if you've got the photographer add-on installed, you can jump over into that. And in render queue, you can just render out the image. Alternatively, you can just come to render image. That's also going to do the same thing. So this one is useful if you're trying to render multiple ones out. So we can start to render this and you can see how this is coming together. So some stuff in the background here doesn't seem to be looking like it's showing up. So what I'd like to do is just double check my flowers are all set up to be rendering in there and nothing is going to be... Yeah, these... Okay, let's have a look. Object mode. So I check there's no kind of like keyframes or anything. The other thing I do also have on these is I have bend on a lot of these and the bend is actually turned off. So what's happening here, looking at this, you can see the issue is that this is being enabled in the viewport. So that's changing the way that these flowers look. So wherever I've disabled it, I'm just going to basically delete the bend modifier. So those ones are all enabled. That's all fine. So that should be good. And then the other thing I want to do is in compositing, I want to make sure that I'm in the right compositor basically here, because this isn't actually setting up the correct one. So we need to make sure we're in the right flower scene. What I'll sometimes do as well is for the compositor, I'll just duplicate this guy. So I can have the plain scene and then I can just select this guy afterwards basically. So that's kind of useful if you are rendering multiple view modes and you want to make sure that you aren't going to lose your data. Basically, you can select between them. So just to cover this briefly, I also have a mask which I have set up to be blurred. And essentially what this is doing in the compositor is just a vignette on the edges of the image. And then I just multiply that back on top. So that's kind of my standard compositing that I usually do. And then from here, we'll just go back over. Now we've got that set up. We should be able to render this out without it causing any problems again. So let me try and just re-render that. So let's come over here. So this should be rendering out everything with all the flowers in the right positions again now, which is good. And then we'll just let that finish up. So now we have our render of our beetle. Okay, so that's working pretty nicely. Now I want to just make sure that this is rendering at a bit higher resolution. So in here I can choose the size that I want to render. So for these I generally will render it more of like a 4K kind of resolution. So I usually render maybe 4,000 pixels wide. This means we're going to get a much sharper image and a much higher resolution. So I'll just run through that process. Basically just going to run through and render out this image. It will take a little bit longer because it's a higher resolution, but we'll get a pretty good result going that way. So I'll just come back once this is finished. Okay, so now this is finished. The first thing I want to do is bring this over into Photoshop. So I've got this here. I'm going to actually just bring the new image in that I've just done. So let me refine the image size. Just make sure we set this up correctly. Okay, so I'm going to pull in the image that I've just rendered into here. Okay, so that's set up. We'll go through the post-processing and things. This is my standard sort of template for post-processing, so I'll go through that in a second, but I just wanted to grab that image and pull that into Photoshop so we can start to work on and edit everything that we have in here. So cool, so that's the first image. Then I want to go over and grab the other image that I've rendered out. So we'll just go through here, we'll just save this, and then I'm going to jump over to the other scene, so the plane scene here. And then so for this one, we would go to compositing and we want to select the plane scene and make sure that we have that one actually in the viewer and everything there. This is a 16:9 as well. So I'm just going to set resolution for that. Okay, and then so for this one, the other thing I wanted to mention is that you may want to change where you're rendering to. Currently, this is just rendering to a temporary folder location, which is what the default is. You can set that over in the output section here. So just basically render out your folder and everything. Just choose your folder location. I'm fine with it being rendered here. So we'll just go for that. And then, so for these, we can now render kind of two of these images at once. We've got this version and this version. So I'll just show that process where it says render two. So I'm just going to hit that and wait for it to render basically. So I'll go through each one of those and render out both of those images so you can kind of see how that's coming together here. And I'll just resume it once it's finished. Okay, so those images are rendered out and presented here in Photoshop. So you can see we have our plain background shot and then also our shot with the beetle on the flower. So now what I want to just cover is the post-processing. In the next video, we'll go through some of the tweaks that I do to the images to finish them up. So before we get into post-processing, I just wanted to touch on a couple of little extra visual flourishes and tweaks I did to images to finalize them. So in this final image, you can see there's a couple of extra little sections to this that I haven't covered in the tutorial. So you can see here that we've got these water droplets and we also have these kind of fine hairs and things. These particular techniques are all done using the geometry nodes and the same modeling techniques that I showed in the earlier parts of the class. So instead of spawning the hairs like we do here, we're just spawning smaller water droplets, and then we're spawning thinner hairs. So the models for those are just slightly different versions of what we have here, and I reuse the same geometry setup for the hairs. So that's some flexibility that technique gives you, is that you can just reuse the network to create these kind of looks. So just wanted to cover that in terms of this image. And then in terms of this one, you can see this is pretty similar to what we have covered here in the blue one, like very similar kind of layout setup and everything, just different color scheme and everything. And then one of the other things I didn't cover is that in some of my other screenshots, I used the rig poses and animation to basically adjust the position of certain bones so that I could create slightly different shots. So like in the top down shot, you can see that we can see into the shell and underneath and everything. And then here as well, same kind of thing. The wings are folded out and we can see into the back of the shell. So this is just done by editing the rig. The camera stays in the same position and the lights and everything are all the same. I just animated or moved the bones basically into place for those shots. So just wanted to show that as well. So as far as post-processing is concerned, I usually have a similar kind of document where I do some refinement to this kind of stuff, and I will just show sort of what I tend to do. So the first part of the process is usually I'll apply some just like basic adjustment levels to things. So I usually will have a levels. The basic levels, I tend to just lift up the blacks in an image because I like to just not have anything looking too dark. So I'll tend to just make a simple levels adjustment. The color lookup tables are really useful. So I will usually just grab one of those guys in there. So you just choose from the adjustment layer color lookup, and then you can select different LUTs. So these will basically recolorize the image. And so what I do is I tend to find a LUT that I like the look of, if it's giving a certain visual kind of tweak to the colors and everything. And then from there, I'll basically drop the opacity of that down. So if it's a little bit too strong, I can adjust it, sort of turn it on and off to see a before and after, right? So depending on the one that you select, you can get different looks. So if I just kill that off, so this is just adjustments. I usually will add a bit of film grain in there. This is just like a standard film grain sort of texture. So when you zoom in, you'll see that it gets like a little bit of grain to everything, which I think adds a nice little visual to everything. And then I have these auto adjustment layers. So these are basically done if you just add levels in there. You can open up the settings for this. So just come over into, so I think it's in the auto options. So if you click this little thing here, go to auto options, you can choose the type of algorithm that it applies. And so basically what this is doing is if we were to collapse down the image, so I'll just do that here, and applied an image auto tone or an image auto contrast or an image auto color, it basically tries to adjust the image based on whether or not the tone of the image, whether or not it's the contrast or the color, right? That's generally what those guys are doing to try and balance out the histograms and adjust the image in general. So these are a dynamic way of doing that. And I tend to have these on a slightly lower opacity, but you can basically apply a levels and then come over to, I mean, you can use an auto levels, or you can go to the auto options and choose these algorithms. And if you hover over them, they'll tell you which one they are. So that one is the auto contrast. This is the auto tone. This one is the auto color. So you can see what it's doing. So auto contrast is actually quite nice in there. You can see that it makes the image a bit more punchier. So that's another adjustment that I'm basically making to that. And we have this color lookup basically on top. And then this is just adding black bars to the image if I need black bars basically. So that's kind of all those do. They're just very light adjustment layers. For this particular project, one of the things I did also adjust was I tried to tweak the levels a little bit of the beetle, because I basically wanted the beetle to just have a little bit more of a darker texture on him. So I just adjusted this kind of mid gray kind of value just by tweaking it slightly to get a little bit more contrast out of it. And you can kind of see the look that kind of gives it. So it makes this darker material appear a little bit darker. That's one of the things that I was basically adjusting. So you can see like in these shots, we have kind of darker material here. So I lighten the background and then darken the dark gray parts basically. I actually did that on the beetle itself, but I made a mask for the beetle using Cryptomatte data. So to do that, that's essentially when you come into your renders, if we go over to Blender, you would turn on the Cryptomatte. So I come over into that guy. It's in one of these options for rendering here. So I think it's in the passes. Yeah, so here you want to come to view layer and then you have Cryptomatte. So I think I turned on the material one, and so when you do a render, this will basically render out that data. If we come over to compositing, you can see that we have the Cryptomatte materials, and then you can use search for Cryptomatte. Whoops, search for the other one, not the legacy one, this guy, and then you just basically plug this into here, and then you can press the plus button and it will allow you to color pick masks for the individual material of the scene. So that's what I did to essentially generate a mask. And so if I open that up, you'll be able to see that mask in the final presentation. So if I show that in here, I've essentially got like a black and white mask for the beetle, and then I can adjust the levels on the beetle specifically. So I can just say, make the beetle a little bit darker if I need to make the beetle darker. So yeah, because generally this is these materials are dark materials, but if you shine a very bright light on a dark material, it tends to be, it's a lot brighter, right? You can see that here in the render. So to get that contrast back, I basically just adjust the levels of the beetle down a little bit so he's sits in the scene how I want him to visually look. So that's something I had to do there just by making that mask. Just wanted to cover that as well. But you can see that the basic adjustment for everything is the same. So we just have our post-processing and everything kind of coming in on top. Gives that kind of overall color adjustment to the final shot there. So that's my post-processing pass. It's a very simple, mostly just using adjustment layers to tweak some of the values and the colors. I do most of the work as far as tweaking how I want it to visually look over when I'm actually rendering it. So that's tends to be my workflow in general. And then we can see our beetle and the flower render here. So that's how it's looking. Hey everyone, so I just wanted to recap where we are for this video and also provide some homework expectations for this week. So as far as the content side of things is concerned, we basically covered our basic setup for rendering. We did a quick recap on where we were at with the model in terms of the rig and the animation and everything. And then we set up our basic render scene. We talked about some add-ons and some 3-point lighting setup theory and those kind of things. And then we set up this basic scene that we have, which is the just rendering within a plain background gradient with reflections and things like that. We then did our 3-point lighting setup with polish and everything on this. And then we also set up the flower scene, which is where we have a few more objects we're actually using to give a little bit more of a hero shot to the beetle. And we talked about the approach for positioning these and lining everything up and adjusting the rigs and tweaking everything so we can get our shot how we want it to look. And then we did a little bit of polish to everything, refined the lighting and worked on that 3-point lighting setup as I mentioned. And then we did a pass on just test rendering, getting the renders out of Blender and into Photoshop, did our post-processing pass on these. And then we did briefly talk about some of the final polish tweaks that I did to the original shots to try get those into a really nice spot. So hopefully that kind of shows the process. And as far as the homework is concerned, my expectation this week is from a deliverable perspective is that we were looking at final screenshots of our project. So wherever we are in the project in terms of like, you know, if we've made our own robot asset or we followed along and done more of a beetle example. At this stage, we should have a model that is more finalized in some capacity, you know, textured and rigged and animated and everything. And then once we have that beetle, we can actually present and render that in a nice way. So that's the expectation for the final weekend. So screenshots are kind of what I'd be interested in. Portfolio renders basically at this stage because we are at the end of the course and this is final presentation. So that would be the expectation for this week.